This is a very special high point in our conference. The Saturday evening time has been designated for the Dorothy Briley Lecture. Dorothy Briley was the editor-in-chief and publisher of Clarion Books, who not only promoted children's literature and quality books for children, but also took seriously her commitment to children's books on the global stage. Dinah Stevens remembered Ms. Briley at the inauguration of this lecture series as one who was committed idealistically to internationalism in children's books as a way of building a sense of community among all human beings. Since 1999, the lecture has been given biannually at the IBI Regional Conference by a speaker who is of international significance in the children's book world. I'd like to thank the members of the 2015 Dorothy Briley Committee, Ginny Moore Cruz, Ruth Lowry, who is here with us tonight, Julia Lopez Robertson, for their hard work in selecting the 2015 Dorothy Briley Lecturer, who is Susan Cooper. Who better to deliver this year's Dorothy Briley Lecture than this master of fantasy writing? Her Dark is Rising sequence is set in historic England and Wales and is grounded in Arthurian legend, Celtic, Welsh, and Norse mythology. These books have won many, many awards, I won't list them now, including the Best English Language Book with an authentic Welsh background, and that is given by the Welsh Books Council. This epic series allows children to go beyond the borders of this world and consider complexities such as good versus evil. The more recent Bogart series blends a real-world setting in the fantastic character of the Bogart when she whisks her characters to the Castle Keep in Scotland. If you've read her essays in Dreams and Wishes, Essays on Writing for Children, you know we are in for a treat. So please welcome our 2015 Dorothy Briley Lecturer, Susan Cooper.
Thank you, Doris. Well, after your rich full day, this is the Dorothy Briley Memorial Lecture, and I'm really honored to have been asked to present it. She was a remarkable lady, Ms. Briley, pillar of publishing, and I thought our lives had touched at some point, but I could never find the memory. She was, as you heard, editor-in-chief at Clarion. She was one of those several post-war pioneers who founded and nurtured the whole business of children's book publishing in America. Another one of them was my own longtime editor, Margaret K. McElderry. They were both stalwart supporters of IBI. They were legends, these ladies. And one day back in 1992, Margaret McElderry was about to turn 80. She was still working away merrily. And a friend and I decided to create a birthday tribute from her authors and illustrators and friends. So I wrote to about 100 of these people, asking for letters or drawings. I said to them, I do hope you'll join in celebrating the first 80 years of the most life-enhancing lady we'll ever meet. I do realize, I said, that in academia, this kind of enterprise is called a Festschrift. But I'm dodging the word because I have such trouble pronouncing it. So this flood of artwork and words came in. And the other day at home, I came across a file of all the covering letters that the contributors had sent me. One of the letters was headed Clarion Books. Dear Susan, it said, thank you for asking me to contribute to Margaret's 80th birthday Festschrift. I can't pronounce it either, at least not without spitting. It's moments like this that make me jealous of artists. It would be so much nicer to draw a pretty picture for her. I like your description, life-enhancing lady. That she is, every inch of her. With all best wishes, Dorothy Briley. So that's where my flicker of memory came from. And I think we're completing some kind of circle here. And maybe paying tribute to editors, without whom those of us who write the books would be lost. They nurture us, they keep us honest and grammatical. They are our parents. They can always be relied upon to say the right thing. Well, nearly always, which is my excuse for telling you what I think is my favorite editor story. There was one day, halfway through my writing life, when my beloved Margaret McElderry nearly made me commit suicide. We'd done 5 or 6 books together, and I was having a really bad time finding an idea for the next one. I was miserable. I called Margaret. I was like a child wailing to Mum. I wanted to be hugged and stroked and reassured that everything was going to be all right. I told her about the problems I was having, and I said desperately, I feel as if my talent had just died. And there was a short pause, and Margaret said thoughtfully, yes, well, that can happen. She went on to add, of course, that she was sure it couldn't have happened to me, but by then the damage was done. But she was performing her job as an editor. She was telling the truth. They told the truth, those 2 ladies, those editorial giants, and they searched for it, both inside the United States and out of it. They were regulars at that lovely international marketplace, the Bologna Book Fair. And they pushed their companies to publish more children's book translations than any of their contemporaries. They believed in introducing children to unfamiliar cultures. When Margaret bought my first children's book from its London publisher in 1965, it joined a stable that included Margaret Mahy from New Zealand, Patricia Wrightson from Australia, Erik Blegvad from Denmark, and several authors from Japan. And Dorothy Briley had the same kind of list. But by 1990, she wrote an article about publishing translations that showed they'd both been battling considerable odds. She talked about the financial and logistical risks in America and Britain of publishing translated books. This even though the Mildred Batchelder Award had been established for 20 years. She said, "It is not at all remarkable that so few translations are published each year. It's not the unwillingness of publishers to provide more translated books, but the seeming disinterest in them that keeps the list short." Well, that was written 25 years ago, and is the same true today. As we've been hearing, it still takes more effort and expense to find books worth translating, but some things have improved, especially in the area of picture books. In Britain, there are more prizes now for children's book translation, like the ESU's Biennial Marsh Award, and the newer one called Found in Translation. The Kate Greenaway Medal is already open to translated works, and as of next year, the Carnegie Medal will be too. In some European countries with strong arts councils, there are grants available to help with translation costs. I'm told that American publishers could apply for these, but they don't. And the list of Batchelder Prize winners seems to show that some houses care much more about translation than the rest, notably Erdmanns and Delacourt and Arthur A. Levine. Naturally, a book's chances of being translated skyrocket if it's a huge bestseller in its own country, or if it wins some award. Publishing is a business, and buzz helps sales. But buzz is more common on adult lists. In the English-speaking world of children's books, we have no equivalent for the mega sales of Stieg Larsson or Haruki Murakami, or more recently, Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan series. We had Harry Potter, but he was written in English to begin with. And some foreign writers for children remain under the radar unless championed by a crusading translator like Laura Watkinson, who, as you heard, when Pushkin Press published Tonka Dutch books in English for the first time last year, they'd already been worldwide classics since 1962. The Bologna and Frankfurt book fairs are even more vital to this cause today than they were before. And so, of course, is Ibby. And as Ginny Moore Cruz reminded me, an awful lot depends on the commitment of an editor. I don't know what fueled Dorothy Briley's commitment to publishing books in translation, Ginny said. She seemed to be fearless. She published Hiroshima no Pika because it had to be published in the US, and she was greatly criticized for this. Margaret McElderry, said Ginny, had such a deep aesthetic life of the mind. She had so many contacts and admirers in the wider book community. Both of these giants had the authority as well as the interest and inclination. They developed their contacts. It isn't a coincidence that each was invited to become IBI president, because each was genuinely interested beyond the bottom line. The most important thing in the whole equation has to be the skill of the translator. Though for the writer of any nationality, it's impossible to know whether your foreign editions are actually speaking to the reader in your own voice. The only language I can read besides English is French, very badly, but well enough to feel that the French translations really work. But what about the languages I don't speak? I gaze in wonder at the editions in Norwegian or Czech, Finnish or Vietnamese, Japanese or Dutch. Who knows what they say to their readers? Once in a great while, something does make you wonder, like the Chinese edition of a book of mine called Oversea Under Stone. This is a story in which three rather ordinary present-day English children on holiday in a Cornish village find themselves following clues on an old map to diminish the rising powers of the dark. But the book's Chinese cover shows an exotic boy clad like a young prince, gazing by candlelight at a golden chalice. And the pictures inside are interesting. There's a drawing of a 19th century family on a railway platform beside an antique locomotive puffing out steam. Then there's a picture of two modern children on the foredeck of a motor launch, one of them wearing a jaunty sailor's cap. And my favorite is a picture of a small Victorian girl in a forest facing a large black gentleman in shirt sleeves and suspenders who might be a lumberjack. It has echoes of Little House on the Prairie and Huckleberry Finn. And like the other illustration, it has absolutely nothing to do with Oversea Under Stone. I assume, I hope, that this is a case of a harassed Chinese art editor grabbing random Western pictures from his file to meet a deadline. And the poor Chinese translator who had done the text must have had a fit. Translating is an astoundingly difficult job. and its best practitioners deserve sainthood, I think. In publishing, as in politics and business and love, nothing is more important than making sure that each of us understands completely what the other one is saying. The translator has the responsibility of expressing one culture through the language of another, which involves endless nuance of word and expression, and more so for a novel, where he or she has to have much the same talent as the writer. If a beautiful, touching, or funny story is going to remain beautiful, or funny, or touching. So the Killit people who award the Carnegie Medal haven't just extended eligibility to translations. They're going to list the translators as co-authors, quote, in recognition of their contribution to storytelling. And I should think so too. Without those wizards, there would be no doors in the walls that separate the cultures of our world. So, as far as translation of children's books goes, have we improved at opening those doors? Remember what Dorothy Briley said 25 years ago? It is not the unwillingness of publishers to provide more translated books, but the seeming disinterest in them that keeps the list short. It seems to me that the people in the book business are doing their best, but disinterest, that key word, hasn't changed enough. Translations still make up at most 3% of all the books published in the United States, as opposed to 27% in France, 30% in Spain, and 40% in Turkey. Supply generally follows demand. So where is the demand from the readers? Maybe they've forgotten where a great many of our most familiar stories come from. The original national differences inside the fabric of children's literature are so old that they've faded from view long since. Aesop's fables went from Greek to Latin to assorted medieval European languages. The tales that we call the Arabian Nights started filtering west from India, Persia, and the Middle East around the 10th century. The Brothers Grimm published their tales in German. Hans Christian Andersen wrote in Danish. All those romantic fables about King Arthur and Camelot were lifted by Sir Thomas Malory from the 13th century French. Today, familiarity has made those beginnings irrelevant, unless you're doing a degree in comparative literature. Everyone knows the stories, since they have universal echoes. Nobody cares where they came from. American children scarcely noticed that Pippi Longstocking was Swedish, Tintin was Belgian, or that every book by Cornelia Funke was actually written in German. Lewis Carroll was an Englishman, but his Alice stories belong now to children who speak 174 different languages. And any really appealing old fable or folk tale from a particular culture has been often retold in the language of another. Those timeless, familiar stories I've just mentioned have one major thing in common. Nearly all of them are fantasies. Maybe fantasy is the one kind of story that can find a direct response in the imagination of any kid in the world, no matter what his or her language or culture. Maybe fantasy in particular tells a universal truth. That old magician, J.R.R.R. Tolkien, wrote a famous essay on fantasy. He called it On Fairy Stories, but he didn't just mean stories about fairies. He said, "The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high, and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. Those are universals, that's for sure. Wonderland doesn't belong to the geopolitical landscape. Magic has no national boundaries. And by magic, I don't mean superstition or voodoo or any of the bad words that one religion calls another. I mean the quality of an imaginative creation that makes a listening child go, oh. Or, as Robert Graves said about true poetry, makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Fantasy does that, if you can get it right. It can last through time, and it can do pretty well with space. Earlier this year, I had a letter from an Englishman named Paul Anderson, who as a child in Northumberland was caught by my Darkest Rising books. He said, my mum was a librarian, she had good taste. And he felt that they, quote, captured the resonance and magic of the history, the land, and the language. As a grown-up, Mr. Anderson has been living for the last 11 years in Algeria, married to an Algerian. And he wants to translate The Darkest Rising first into a Berber language called Kabyle, if that's how you pronounce it, and then into a Pan-Berber coin, lingua franca, that would reach groups across North Africa. It's his reason for this that fascinated me. He wrote, the Berber languages of the region have an ancient culture, but are only just starting to become a window on other cultures. The idea of magic, amulets and symbols, curses, layers of buried reality, is every day here. Aspects of local culture that would never be discussed in a newspaper, and that people might not want to discuss with a visitor. In Algeria, the world of magic is real to people to this day. And not just rural older people, it's general, he said. Are your books so evocative for a British reader because these things are a distant folk memory rather than everyday beliefs? Maybe in Algeria, the stories would seem less strange, less magical. I don't know yet. But I'm sure that the magic and historical references would translate well. And because of their status as a minority, displaced culturally by invaders, Berbers are very interested in the Celtic cultures and history of Britain, so would appreciate that element too. They follow Scottish politics closely, he said. I like that bit. This time, it's not simply a matter of translation. Paul Anderson is talking about a connection that's already there, in spite of language. He's talking about the communication behind the words. And that goes to the heart of what I think this conference is considering, when it talks in part about the literary effects of the ever-changing geopolitical landscape. Can we all communicate through children's books? Whether through fantasy or realism, translations or cross-cultural stories, can we turn the digital revolution into a revolution of mutual understanding? Only connect, said E.M. Forster in Howard's End. Live in fragments no longer. It seems to be taking a very long time for us to learn how to do that. I've been writing books published for children for a long time now, for even more years than Dorothy, Briley, and Margaret McElderry edited people like me, telling stories. After all that time, the one question that still eats at me is the one that I suppose IBI was founded to try to solve. Storytelling is almost as old as mankind. Has it any real ability to heal the divisions that endlessly damage this world that we live in? I had a very noisy childhood. The nights were filled with gunfire from the anti-aircraft post at the end of our English road, and the earth-shaking thumps of bombs dropped by the planes droning overhead. When we clambered out of the air raid shelter one night after a raid, the whole eastern half of the sky was glowing red. And my mother said, "That's London burning." World War II didn't end till I was 10 years old. So perhaps it's no wonder that I grew up to write fantasies about us and them, good and evil, the light and the dark. The same thing may well have happened to some other child in Dresden or Hamburg or Hiroshima. We haven't had another world war since then, because of course we invented and twice used a species of weapon so appallingly powerful that a worldwide battle would destroy the planet. But in all the past 7 decades, the wars have gone on a smaller scale. And there have always been, somewhere, children listening to gunfire at night. The Middle East is full of them this very minute, listening, running, seeking shelter beyond their borders, like the children in Central America that we were hearing about just now. We tell each other stories about these conflicts today with an unprecedented ease and swiftness, not only with words on paper, but with images that fly in an instant to little screens all over the world. The stories tell truth, but the truth has no effect, and the fighting goes on, and the divisions remain. Will we ever understand one another? Will we ever listen? Those of us whose stories are published for children, will we ever be able to affect the hostilities that the minds of those children inherit from their parents and their cultures? In our little world of children's books, we try to bridge the gap. We try to encourage translations between languages. We preach diversity. And our children certainly have a greater range of cross-cultural books available to them than any generation has before. Books that can teach an acceptance of difference and, let's hope, destroy prejudice that is based on ignorance. With fantasy or realism, fiction or non-fiction, we can give kids the chance to go through the doors in the walls in this ever-changing geopolitical landscape. But are all the people inside those walls willing to unlock their doors? Let me tell you a story about a book that knocked on a door. 9 years ago, to be closer to my children, I built a house on a little island in an estuary salt marsh in Massachusetts, connected to the mainland by a causeway. There are more birds than people on my almost island. The marsh is all around me, green in spring and golden in fall, and in winter covered in little icebergs. And at very high tides, the sea is all around me instead. The night sky is vast and dark and blazing with stars. It's easy to remember, looking out from here, that 4 centuries ago, this marshland was the home of American Indians. They'd been hunting over it and over the whole continent for thousands of years, until the 17th century, when white traders brought disease in the east, and the Mayflower arrived with 102 white passengers from England, seeking freedom and land. About 4 weeks from today in this country, we shall celebrate Thanksgiving, our biggest family festival of the year, commemorating the day in 1621 when the Pilgrim Fathers gave thanks for their first harvest. At a dinner with the friendly Indians of the Pokanoket tribe who had helped them survive. We do not commemorate the event that came a few decades later, a bitter, bloody conflict between the settlers and the Indians, known as King Philip's War. About 600 settlers died. More than 3,000 Native Americans died, and hundreds more were sent as slaves to the West Indies. Everything had changed, and everything went on changing across the miles and the centuries, until the 1,000 Indian tribes who had covered the American continent were deprived of nearly all its land and reduced to their current 1.7% of the American population. I sat on my peaceful island, this expatriate English person, in the estuary salt marsh where Indians had hunted for so long. And I couldn't stop thinking about all this. I wanted to understand what went wrong at the beginning. There's nobody you can talk to today, white or Indian, who can give you an eyewitness report of what happened 400 years ago. So I started doing research. It took 3 years. I tried to read every single thing that was written back then, every contemporary account, all the primary sources familiar to historians. And because I am not a historian, but a storyteller, my imagination began giving me a story. Basically, it was about 2 17th century boys, one white, one American Indian, and their treatment by the astounding bigotry of the newly arrived Puritans. Those Pilgrim Fathers who flogged Baptists for being Baptists and hanged Quakers for being Quakers and were not the good guys. In this conflict, as in most others, neither side could be described as the good guys. I called my story Ghost Hawk. I think I wanted it to provide a proper context for the happy Thanksgiving image that we give our children, to emphasize both sides of the very lopsided cultural situation that exists today. But life is full of ironies, and as some of you may have noticed, this book, written to deplore bigotry, has encountered a kind of virtual backfire, as have some other recent books by white authors with American Indian characters. I think this is sad. I am a storyteller. I have written a story about human beings and conflict. No, I am not an American Indian, just as I am not a 17th century Puritan boy. But my story about human beings tells the truth. I believe it was Martin Luther King who said that racism is America's original sin. We belong to a nation which did its best to wipe out the people of one race and enslave the people of another. I was born British, into a nation which once arrogantly imposed its rule on the differing races of a third of the globe. But do those histories mean that every succeeding generation is doomed to resentment and guilt? In our world of books, you can say that someone from a race that has suffered from prejudice is entitled to express prejudice of his or her own. But if you live by that argument, when is prejudice ever going to end? Are we not to write cross-cultural books? Should we censor the imagination Not long ago, the Dramatists Guild of the United States asked this of its members, and 24 playwrights of different racial backgrounds said, "Go ahead, we need diversity. I don't object to your creating a character of my racial background, so long as you do your homework and write with respect and understanding." Shouldn't the same be true for books written for the young? The future of international understanding is going to be in the hands of our children, and we can only prepare them for that by explanation of the past, not resentment and hostility. The world is so full of walls, even this one in our own country. If we can't break them down, can't we at least open doors in those walls? On BBC Radio this week, I heard a snatch of an interview from the South Sudan, a Romeo and Juliet story about a boy and girl from warring tribes, the two of them desperate to be together, but trapped by the murderous past decades of their families. I can't forget something the girl said, lyrical in her fractured English. "People has to let go what have happened," she said. "People has to let go what have happened." As a writer, I'm given hope by the comments of someone from my children's generation, Jean Yang, talking not this afternoon, but at the National Book Festival in DC last year, after American-Born Chinese was the first graphic novel to be a finalist for the National Book Award. Jean said then, "We in the book community are in the middle of a sustained conversation about diversity. We talk about our need for diverse books with diverse characters, written by diverse writers. I wholeheartedly agree, but I have noticed an undercurrent of fear in many of our discussions. We're afraid of writing characters different from ourselves because we're afraid of getting it wrong. We're afraid of what the internet might say." He said, "This fear can be a good thing if it drives us to do our homework, to be meticulous in our cultural research. But this fear crosses the line when we become so intimidated that we quietly make choices against stepping out of our own identities. After all, our job as writers is to step out of ourselves and encourage our readers to do the same. Let your fear drive you to do your homework," he said. "But no matter what, don't ever let your fear stop you." And I shall try to remember that. As I said at the start, I'm proud to give this talk named for Dorothy Briley, who was one of those pioneers of cross-cultural communication. And I want to pay tribute to all her successors out there who are doing the same thing against odds that are never going to change very much. We seek universal understanding in the teeth of the fact that the whole human race is incorrigibly tribal and has to be constantly reminded to curb its suspicions and resentments. It's not only the writers who have to be brave, it's their editors and publishers. And their risks are not only financial. I can still remember seeing the armed guards outside Penguin's London offices after Salman Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, came out in 1988 and prompted a fatwa from the supreme leader of Iran. Rushdie narrowly escaped assassination. His Japanese translator didn't. And even now, earlier this week, Iran pulled out of the Frankfurt Book Fair after hearing that Rushdie would appear there. There will always be the temptation to avoid publishing a good book if you think it may cause trouble. And beyond the editors and publishers, for the sake of cross-cultural understanding, Teachers and librarians and parents, too, need to be watchful and aware in this age where prejudice can swell into a tsunami on the faceless internet. Don't take hostile commentary as gospel without reading the book being commented on. Give the book a chance. And who knows? Perhaps we shall then have the chance of achieving what old Tolkien, in his reflections on fantasy called Fairy Story, described as the consolation of the happy ending. If tragedy is the highest form of drama, he said, the opposite is true of fairy story. I will call it eucatastrophe, he said, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. It does not deny the existence of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. But it denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. May we all go on doing our best to open doors in the walls of the world. Thank you.